The next talk is by Yolande Harley, and she's going to talk to us about bottom-up approaches to engage and develop scientific capacity in Africa.
Great, thank you very much for having me here to speak with you today. I'm not going to be giving a scientific presentation. I'm going to be telling you about some programs that have been involved in looking at research capacity development in Africa. And specifically two of them, the Wellcome Center for Infectious Diseases Research in Africa, run out of the University of Cape Town, and the Crick African Network, which is a multi-institutional collaboration. And just to say up front, the director of both of these programs is Robert Wilkinson, who's tri-affiliated with the University of Cape Town, the Imperial College London, and the Francis Crick Institute London. But he's unable to be with us today, so you have me telling the story instead. Let me just find the clicker. Here we go. So this, a lot of people before me have already spoken about. These are some of the ongoing challenges for research capacity in Africa. We have insufficient skilled people, and some of the things contributing to this are that the demands of clinical service are very great due to the high disease burden in many countries in Africa, which prevents academic clinicians getting involved in research. There's also very high teaching demands, and this affects both the clinical and the basic scientists trying to establish their research careers. Something that often happens is a bit early is promotion, and while we think of promotion as a good thing, if you graduate with your PhD and within 1 year have been promoted to become a head of department because there aren't sufficient PhD qualified academics to take on those roles, then while that might seem like a good step for your career, you're going to spend a lot of time on administration and you don't end up with that protected time to focus on your research and develop your own scientific portfolio. In many African countries, we're generating too few medical graduates to deal with the burden of disease. But also a lot of these graduates, and indeed some of the basic science graduates, are not competitive for international fellowship support without some form of priming. They've got the ability, they just don't have that exposure to the bigger world of science that a lot of young researchers from high-income countries have. If we look at insufficient facilities, again, as a result of the tremendous disease burden, there's this pressure on clinical facilities and they're ill able to cope with hosting research in those facilities at the same time. There are very few academic critical masses, outmoded or unserviceable equipment, and a lack of skilled technical and administrative support systems and personnel in certain areas. And then the final point here relates to insufficient interaction and sharing within Africa. So we know, people have mentioned it before, this difficult, expensive internal transport within the continent. It's often easier to get from Cape Town to Europe than it is to somewhere in Africa, for me. Poor and expensive internet connectivity. And then driven by the dominance of international funding, there's often this northern-driven competition rather than south-south collaboration, which we would really love to see more of. And a final point here is there's underdeveloped research management, and we tend to focus on individual researchers and their abilities, but we don't often look at the institution. And so I wanted to say a few points in this regard, because if the institution is struggling, the scientists within it are going to struggle to be enabled to do their research. And low-middle-income country institutions often have less well-funded research support, and they face additional support challenges. So for example, I was chatting to a group at lunch, saying a big bugbear for me is this inability of a lot of low-middle-income countries to recoup sufficient indirect costs to support the direct costs of the research that's going on in their institution. Also, with the dominance of international funding, there's the challenge of mitigating currency fluctuation risks and maintaining compliance with a range of international funder policies. There's the challenge of managing expectations about co-financing models, so sometimes funders will expect the local government or institution to put in matched funding for a program, which can be very difficult to do depending on your financial situation. Again, mentioned previously, this budgeting for higher or additional costs, so already been mentioned is this higher cost of consumables in Africa than in the US, for example. But also added costs. So for example, if you're conducting clinical work in a low-income setting where there's a high crime rate, you may need to budget additional costs just to make that place safe and secure for you to do your work. Planning for longer delivery times, we've heard this one before, protecting ownership of outputs, and just a note here that with the move towards open access, there's a call for researchers to put their data in an open access platform soon after the closure of a grant. However, if you're in a low-income setting where you don't have that much skilled technical resource to help you analyze your data quickly, there's a fear that if you put it out there in an open platform, before you get a chance with your low resource to analyze that data, somebody from a high-income country is going to swoop in, analyze it all, and benefit more from the data you've generated than you will. So there are concerns about that we need to address. And of course, we need to ensure appropriate ethics support for vulnerable populations in that location. And then also deal with managing environmental and infrastructural challenges that can be worse in low middle income country settings like power outages, lack of water supply, etc. So if I look at the first of the two programs I'm going to talk about, this is the Wellcome Centre for Infectious Disease Research in Africa, or CIDRI-Africa. It's run out of UCT, and the photo on the top left there shows you the university. Beautiful setting, research-intensive institution in an affluent suburb. 20 minutes away, you have the photo on the top right, which is Khayelitsha, peri-urban township, a low-income setting with a very, very high disease burden. And CIDRI-Africa runs its clinical research sites out of this setting, and we work with the community there to try to generate new medical knowledge. But it reflects this quote from the NEJM in 2014, that the health and well-being of most South Africans, and indeed Africans in general, remain plagued by a relentless burden of infectious and non-communicable diseases, persisting social disparities, and inadequate human resources to provide care for a growing population. And if we look at the precursor of our Wellcome Centre, CIDRI, when that kicked off in 2008, the life expectancy in South Africa was in the early 50s, predominantly due to high burdens of things like HIV and TB, which again has been mentioned by a previous speaker. South Africa accounts for 11% of the global AIDS-related deaths and 19% of global HIV-positive TB mortality. So there's a very high disease burden. And we obtained a Wellcome Trust Strategic Award to develop research capacity to try to tackle these sorts of challenges. And this included promoting scientific interactions, increasing health sciences training opportunities, promoting regional collaboration, and then providing core support to add value to other Wellcome-funded research at UCT. And just to say, with regards to the research capacity development, some of this was physical, so the development of both clinical and laboratory research facilities. The clinical was mainly in Khayelitsha, the low-income setting that was in that previous photograph. And the laboratory research capacity development was mainly in the Institute of Infectious Disease and Molecular Medicine at the UCT Health Sciences campus, where we focused on trying to purchase some high-end equipment and improve the biosafety level facilities so we could work with infectious disease samples. And importantly, the investment here also helped us to leverage co-funding from other institutions such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and indeed the South African government. With regards to human capacity development, we funded a number of research entry awards at the PhD and postdoctoral level, 92% going to researchers from Africa, as well as supporting 17 scientific meetings and workshops with bursaries to 105 emerging researchers. And between these awards and meetings, this led to support for early career researchers from 27 different African countries. So the idea was not just for the University of Cape Town to benefit, but to try to help expand that benefit more broadly. And the success of this initiative led to an invitation from the Trust to apply to their centres competition, and we were successful in receiving one of the Wellcome Centres of Excellence, the only one outside the UK, for a centre to conduct high-quality translational infectious diseases research in a setting of tremendous disease burden. And it's doing this by fostering investigator-led approaches, bottom-up approaches, by an overarching scientific theme of combating infection, especially HIV-1 and TB, via clinical and laboratory research. And this centre is underpinned by 3 shared research platforms that help to support all the researchers affiliated with the centre to deliver their work. A basic science platform to expand capacity and scope for scientific investigations, especially with the safe handling of infectious materials. A clinical research platform based out in Khayelitsha, predominantly to enhance capacity for experimental medicine in a near-patient setting. And then a biomedical data integration platform headed up actually by Nikki Mulder, sitting in the back, who you'll hear from just now, which looks to bring together all the data that our researchers are generating from the bioinformatics data all the way through to epidemiology and population health data, and to try to find ways to integrate and analyze this meaningfully. Although the centre is a centre of excellence rather than a capacity development initiative per se, in no large research entity can you ignore your investigator pipeline. You need to explore that depth, and especially so in Africa. So in addition to having our 12 principal investigators who are the co-applicants on the grant, we built a cohort underneath them of contributing investigators who both contribute to the centre and benefit from it. And they have the possibility of evolving in this cohort over time, potentially becoming more leading researchers. And especially here, we try to focus on getting broader representation of the demographic population of South Africa into that cohort, because historically, the older generation of researchers in South Africa are predominantly white and male. And in addition, we try to build in international researchers into that cohort. And then underneath that, we have another cohort of earlier career researchers that involves 3 new intermediate level recruits, 10 postdocs and 5 PhDs co-supported by the University of Cape Town with funding. And then also we assigned a mentee to each one of the principal investigators for them to work with and help develop over the course of the centre grant. And these were again targeted specifically at people from underrepresented demographic groups in South Africa. And I'll just mention this very quickly. It's just to say, with all the generation of high-quality scientific papers, the importance is still that we translate this new knowledge towards policy and practice, and below are just a few examples of ways over the last decade that we have influenced policy and practice in South Africa. So the second program is the Crick African Network. This is a partnership between the Francis Crick Institute in London and 5 different African partners funded by the UKRI GCRF initiative. The question of why to do it, well, it's pretty much the same as for the Wellcome Centre. It's dealing with this disproportionate disease burden with the inability to cope with that through our research. And the goal was to strengthen existing and develop new collaborations between Crick, a new institute in London, and Africa via an intermediate level investigator-driven network. And the network members were the West African Global Health Alliance, administered through LSHTM MRC Gambia, the MRC UVRI unit in Uganda, the Universities of Cape Town and Stellenbosch in South Africa, and the University of Ghana, where Gordon Awandara, who you've already heard from, is the lead on that side. It kicked off with a roadshow symposium and associated workshop, where we brought together high-level presenters from both the African institutions and the Crick to share their science, followed by research protocol-driven workshops, where we brought in early career researchers from a range of countries in Africa to bring their research projects to us, and we did an iterative protocol development session with them to hash out how they could improve their science, and then they presented it to their peers for critique. But the core of the network is really these African Career Accelerator Awards, which are 18 high-value competitive awards for African postdoctoral scientists, awarded over 3 rounds. They're 2-year fellowships with advanced training at the Crick, but importantly with a return component back at their home African institution to help them re-establish themselves with funding at their home institution. They get access to state-of-the-art Crick science technology platforms and inclusion in their postgrad programs, and there's bilateral or trilateral supervision with both a supervisor at the African institution and 1 or 2 at the Crick. And then importantly, over the course of these fellowships, we're going to try to work with the awardees in writing further grants, so that we expect them to have submitted at least 1 further fellowship application or project grant application by the end of their fellowship, with a view to aiming towards sustainability of their research portfolio. And of course, we have annual scientific meetings. So this just shows the spread of attendees of the workshops that we held, and the overall satisfaction, which in general was very high. They felt it was useful to them. And when we asked why, what they found particularly useful, and generated a word cloud from that, what came up quite strongly was the experience in proposal development, grant writing, learning about that, working on their protocols, presenting them to others, this ability to be able to market your own science and to learn how to go out there and find your own funding so that you can then one day independently find your own research programs. In terms of the application process for the fellowships, pretty standard. There was an expression of interest. We played a brokering role in linking them up with potential supervisors at the Crick. They usually had one in Africa already. Sent the application, invited full applications, sent those out for peer review, did shortlisting, interviewed them in the African home institutions, and then made the selection of awards. And this just shows that by the end of the 3rd round of calls for fellowships, we had applications or expressions of interest at least from 24 different countries in Africa. So although these had to come in via one of the 5 African partners, we invited them from all over Africa. They could come from anywhere. And this just shows the attrition from submission of the expressions of interest through to the eventually awarded fellowships. There's a higher attrition rate in the first 2 rounds, and we think this is partly because we learned how to target the calls better to the types of applicants that would be most appropriate for this sort of scheme, and then also mentor them better over the course of the application process so that they could submit their best possible applications and not fall off as easily over time. So these are our awardees, 5 in the first round, 4 in the second, and 9 in the third round. And while we initially expected them to spend approximately a year at the Crick and a year back home, we soon realized that was not necessarily the best option. We needed to be more flexible. So we've allowed them to tailor their time at the different institutions according to what best suits both their project and their personal circumstances, for example, childcare. And you can see in the blue is the time they're going to be spending at the Crick for each person, the orange at their home African institution, and the yellow at other African institutions. And a last point on this network is to show the diversity within the awards. The 5 African partners are on the top left there, and you can see that the institution that did particularly well was Backbook from Ghana, so Gordon's group. They really sang. We got some incredibly strong applications from them. The gender distribution was pretty even. The award mark pending has now actually been awarded, so 8 of the 18 fellowships were female. And the disease focus was dominated by malaria and TB. So I just wanted to finish off by sharing some learnings with you that we've had over these programs. And with regard to early career research or intermediate researcher programs, it's important to recognize that the research career path may vary significantly in different locations. So some young academics have to work between their postgraduate programs or in conjunction with their PhD to be able to financially sustain themselves, which means they may only end up at the same stage of their scientific career much later than people from high-income countries. In addition, different countries and institutions across Africa may most need fellowship support at different stages of their career pathway. In some countries, people may be dropping out of the pipeline 1-2 years post-PhD. For other people, it might be 5-6 years post-PhD when they run out of postdocs and they don't know where to go from there. Again, we recognize that culturally, some early career researchers really need encouragement in liaising with senior academics. They feel intimidated telling the academic what they need from them and pushing them. And it actually, you've got somebody with incredible talent and you need to help support them in how they can relate to some senior academics. And this speaks to the brokering of the candidate-supervisor relationships. Grant writing is still one of the biggest training needs for early career researchers. And I would encourage any senior academics in the room to really encourage their young researchers to start writing grants as early as possible. Or whether it's contributing to a larger consortium application, for example, of that academic. Even if you just get them to review and red pen a draft proposal for you, that's going to get them a lot of experience. One thing we did find is that it was important to allow sufficient time between an expression of interest and a full application. So if you're running your own grant scheme, really try to give inexperienced researchers enough time to develop the best proposal that they can develop. In addition, we found that a 2-year fellowship isn't always enough to encourage people back from the diaspora. Quite a few people said, look, I kind of need salary commitment for about 5 years before I'm willing to take the leap and come back home. And the final 2 points there were that if you're hosting visiting fellows in high-income countries, try to think about how you might help to engineer a soft landing for them on their return back to their African country so they don't feel like they've come from a really fancy facility and go back home into a broom cupboard. So in general, we try to have a flexible, bottom-up or investigator-led and supportive approach. And my final few broader take-home messages here are in proposal development, collaboratively, engage early and engage meaningfully. So involve all your partner researchers and their administrative staff in collaborative proposal and budget development as early as possible so that you develop something meaningful and feasible for that with that partner. And to iterate again, that low and middle income country partners need as much access to indirect cost support as possible. We've had high income countries wanting to cut this out of our budgets. Please, we need it desperately. Be cautious in top-down partnerships. While institutional management-led MOUs can be fabulous things, if you don't have a passionate, driven academic on the ground who's willing to drive that program through, it's likely to fail. If you're running a consortium or a network with advisory board members, please try to appoint people with some local knowledge of the setting they're going to work in. Bear in mind that certain activities may take longer in a low middle income country and build this into your timelines. Recognize that a site visit will do wonders to broaden your perspective in both directions. It shows you the challenges your partner may be facing, as well as the opportunities that could add strength to your project. And the last 3 are given. Respect language challenges, provide regular research program updates to all your partners, which doesn't always happen, and take an equitable approach to fund sharing and data sharing. And this doesn't mean giving everybody an equal share of the budget, it means giving them an appropriate share of the budget for the piece of work they need to do to achieve their role in the project. And this is just to point out 2 initiatives to you that you may want to look up yourself. The African Academy of Sciences-led research management program in Africa, which is looking at creating and sustaining enabling research environments with a focus on research management. And then the co-ed-led, which looks at steps you can take to help ensure fairness in research partnerships, both before, during, and eventually after research. So those are programs I would recommend you involve yourself in if you can. So thank you very much.
You talk about soft landing for postgraduates. What do you mean in actual fact? Practically, how do you, I know that for example the 2-year postdoc, what do you do for them so that they can go back where there are many in Africa, they don't go back somewhere. So what practically do you do? The soft landing.
So 2 practical things that we've tried, for example, in this Crick African Network. The one is when you engage in the initial partnership, try to make it around a project that will end up being something potentially feasible to conduct back in Africa afterwards, either with the current state of play or with the enhanced technology you hope to potentially bring there. So design the project around something where you see a future in that place, whether it's in your head or whether it's already there in practice. And then secondly, if you've got a long-term budget that you're working with, think about how you might actually be able to spend some of that budget helping the development of the technologies or the infrastructure or the expertise back at that African institution. So when that researcher goes back there, he's got a small piece of equipment to run his work with. He's got a PhD student who he can use to do some of the work with him and make him feel like he's got a friend on the ground. So it's both a funding thing and it's a choice of project thing. Sorry?
Are you thinking about, apart from that, attaching to what called the entry grants, where you give them some seed money to do research when they go back?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to sometimes think more creatively when we write even standard project grant applications. We don't think to build things like that in. We say, oh, well, we'll host a fellow in wherever it is, Sweden. We don't tend to say, but for the second half of the grant, we're going to send them back and make sure they've got the infrastructure, or maybe not the full infrastructure, but at least some project costs, so they can go back and start doing that work there, and they don't come home and have to start from scratch with nothing again.
I have one quick question to follow up on that. In addition to funding support, what kind of mentorship runway do you give them as they go to set up their own labs?
Yeah, so very, very good question. And something certainly that we've envisaged through this Crick network is ongoing mentorship, co-mentorship of the fellow by the Crick partner, the group leader or the science technology platform head there, and their African co-supervisor. So we don't want it to be a case of, well, when you leave, we're done with you. We want it to be a case of building an ongoing collaboration. And this was actually something the Crick Institute was very keen on. They wanted to see this as the start of a long-term collaboration. We want to choose the best people. Have work with you collaboratively back in your own setting where we can benefit from what you can bring and you can benefit from what they can bring. And what that means is, moving forward, you can also co-apply on grant applications, bringing the weight of different people's CVs and environments to that grant application. So it is seen as an ongoing thing, and absolutely it's not just about the money.